Parents called me a fraud in front of guests. I owned the venue. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My mother pointed her crystal champagne flute at me and screamed, "Get this fraud out of my party." The sharp, piercing sound of Eleanor's voice echoed off the vaulted glass ceilings of the glass house, slicing right through the elegant, sophisticated hum of a live string quartet playing softly in the background. 200 of the city's most elite, wealthy, and status-obsessed socialites turned perfectly in sync to stare at me. I could see the malicious, unadulterated triumph dancing in my mother's meticulously Botoxed eyes. She was wearing a custom, imported silk gown that probably cost significantly more than the very first car I ever owned, and she looked absolutely thrilled to finally, publicly, put her monumental disappointment of a daughter exactly where she felt I belonged, in the dirt. For 29 years, I had been the designated black sheep of this incredibly toxic family. I was Chloe, the stubborn failure who walked away from a highly prestigious pre-law program to wash grease off dirty plates in a sweltering commercial kitchen. To Eleanor, my very existence was a dark smudge on her pristine, country club reputation. She wanted me completely humiliated, emotionally destroyed, and physically dragged out by security in front of all her high society peers. Have you ever watched a raging narcissist's brain short-circuit in real time? It is a slow, deeply satisfying psychological thriller, and I was holding the director's script. What my mother didn't know, what absolutely nobody in my entire family knew, was that the breathtaking, ultra-luxury botanical event space they had rented for their lavish 30-year anniversary gala didn't belong to some faceless corporate hospitality group. Every single rare exotic orchid, every hand-cut crystal chandelier, and every square inch of the polished marble floor beneath her expensive designer heels belonged exclusively to me. I had spent the last 5 years bleeding, sweating, and silently building a massive business empire in the shadows while they endlessly mocked my little catering hobby. Now, the trap was fully set, the wealthy audience was captivated, and my arrogant mother had just handed me the live microphone. She was loudly demanding that the impeccably dressed general manager throw me out onto the street immediately. She had no idea the security guards in this building answered directly to me. To truly understand the absolute poetry of this confrontation, you have to understand the suffocating psychological warfare I grew up enduring. In our household, love was never unconditional. It was a highly volatile currency strictly tied to academic prestige, social networking, and outward appearances. Eleanor viewed children not as human beings, but as luxury accessories meant to be bragged about at charity luncheons. When I was 20 years old, I realized the thought of becoming a corporate lawyer made me physically ill. I found my true passion in the chaotic, high-adrenaline world of hospitality. I loved the meticulous orchestration of a perfect dinner service, the intense pressure of the kitchen, and the tangible reward of creating unforgettable experiences. So, I dropped out of university. The fallout was apocalyptic. Eleanor looked at me as if I had just confessed to a violent crime. My father stood silently behind her, shaking his head in profound disgust while she delivered her grand, theatrical ultimatum. She told me that no daughter of hers was going to be a glorified servant, and ordered me to re-enroll in law school or face complete financial excommunication. When I refused to back down, they cut my phone plan, canceled my health insurance, and literally packed my belongings into trash bags. For the next 5 years, I worked brutal, bone-crushing 80-hour weeks. I started as a dishwasher, moved up to line cook, became a shift supervisor, and eventually started managing failing restaurants, turning their profit margins around through sheer, unyielding willpower. I missed holidays, birthdays, and family vacations because I was too busy scrubbing floors and balancing inventory spreadsheets until 3 in the morning. My parents never called to ask if I was eating or if I could afford my rent. Instead, Eleanor would occasionally send me condescending text messages asking if I was done playing waitress yet. They assumed I was drowning in poverty and regret, eagerly waiting for the day I would crawl back to them on my hands and knees, begging for their forgiveness. I packed my bags that night knowing I would never beg them for anything again. While I was scraping burnt grease off industrial ovens and nursing chemical burns on my hands, my older brother Julian was living an entirely different reality. Julian was the undisputed golden child of the family, a towering monument to my parents' obsession with surface-level perfection. He was 32 years old, armed with an Ivy League finance degree fully paid for by my father, and possessed an ego so massive it generated its own gravitational pull. Julian was a classic finance bro who constantly talked about disruptive algorithms, blockchain technology, and leveraging assets, using a lot of expensive buzzwords that effectively meant absolutely nothing. My parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They bought him a brand new Porsche for his college graduation and essentially funded his incredibly flashy, hollow lifestyle in the city. At family dinners, the rare ones I was actually invited to, Julian would loudly dominate the conversation, bragging about his supposed seven-figure crypto portfolio and his exclusive networking retreats in Miami. Whenever the conversation briefly shifted to me, he would offer a condescending chuckle and ask if I could get him a discount on appetizers at whatever little diner I was currently managing. But the truth, which I had quietly discovered through a mutual friend who worked at his banking firm, was that Julian's entire life was an elaborate, heavily mortgaged illusion. He was drowning in staggering amounts of high-interest credit card debt. His startup ventures were consistently bleeding capital, and his luxury apartment was weeks away from facing eviction proceedings. He was surviving entirely on my parents' endless financial bailouts and a carefully curated Instagram feed. The hypocrisy of it all fueled my ambition like high-octane gasoline. Every time Eleanor praised Julian's non-existent brilliance, while simultaneously trashing my legitimate, grueling hard work, I channeled that intense anger directly into my business plan. I didn't want their toxic approval anymore. I wanted undeniable leverage. I was secretly building a fortress while he was busy playing pretend in a sandcastle. Building the glass house was the hardest, most isolating chapter of my entire life. I spent 2 years living in a cramped, windowless studio apartment situated right above an incredibly noisy dive bar. I slept on a cheap mattress directly on the floor because I couldn't justify spending money on a bed frame when that capital needed to go toward architectural permits and zoning licenses. I took every single dollar I had saved from turning around failing restaurants and pitched my aggressive, highly detailed business model to 17 different banks. 16 of them laughed me right out of their sterile conference rooms. But the 17th bank saw the raw data, recognized my relentless drive, and approved the massive commercial loan I needed to secure an abandoned, historic greenhouse on the edge of the city's wealthiest district. I spent 18 months overseeing the grueling renovations, breathing in toxic drywall dust, arguing fiercely with stubborn contractors, and meticulously sourcing the perfect exotic flora to create an atmosphere of unparalleled, exclusive luxury. When the glass house finally opened its grand doors, it became an instant, viral sensation among the city's ultra-elite. We were booked out 2 years in advance within the first 6 months of operation. But I made a very strategic, calculated decision to keep my name completely off all the public-facing marketing materials. I operated strictly under an LLC, utilizing a discrete corporate structure to ensure absolute privacy. My parents still firmly believed I was a struggling caterer barely scraping by in a tiny apartment, and I violently protected that illusion. I knew that if Eleanor discovered my massive success, she wouldn't be genuinely proud of me. She would simply try to co-opt my achievement, loudly claiming credit for my entrepreneurial spirit to all her snobby friends at the country club. I wanted the complete satisfaction of knowing I built a multi-million-dollar empire without a single drop of their tainted money or fake support. I was finally ready to step out of the shadows, and they were the catalyst. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon when the universe decided to hand me the ultimate, poetic opportunity on a silver platter. I was sitting in my spacious, glass-walled private office overlooking the main botanical atrium, reviewing the quarterly profit margins. Marcus, my incredibly sharp, fiercely loyal general manager, knocked twice and walked in holding a thick, premium leather VIP booking folder. Marcus was a seasoned industry veteran in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, who knew every single detail about my complicated family history. He placed the folder directly onto my desk with a deeply amused smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You are going to want to see this one personally, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with anticipation. I opened the folder and stared at the primary contract. It was a booking for a massive, heavily customized 30-year anniversary gala, complete with top-tier caviar service, vintage champagne towers, and a full-string quartet. The total estimated invoice was floating comfortably around the $80,000 mark. But it wasn't the staggering amount of money that made my heart completely stop in my chest. It was the names printed boldly at the top of the client intake form. Eleanor and Richard Vance. My parents. They had completely bypassed my internal sales team by utilizing an ultra-exclusive, third-party luxury event planner who frequently booked our venue for high-profile celebrity clients. Because the planner handled all the logistical paperwork and non-disclosure agreements, my parents had absolutely no idea who actually owned the magnificent building they were preparing to celebrate their pretentious milestone inside. They just knew it was the most expensive, highly coveted venue in the entire state, which meant it was exactly the kind of place Eleanor needed to validate her shallow existence. The sheer, overwhelming irony of my parents enthusiastically throwing tens of thousands of dollars directly into my corporate bank account was almost too much to process. I stared at the signature on the contract and realized the universe was demanding revenge. For a long, tense moment, I genuinely debated exercising my ownership rights and terminating the contract immediately. I could easily cite a sudden scheduling conflict, return their massive deposit, and completely ruin Eleanor's desperately sought-after social event just weeks before it happened. It would have been incredibly petty, deeply vindictive, and undeniably satisfying in the short term. Marcus leaned against the heavy oak doorframe of my office, watching the intense internal conflict play out across my face. "I can have the cancellation paperwork drafted in 5 minutes, boss," he offered smoothly, his tone completely neutral but supportive. "Or, we can let the event proceed, and you can casually stroll in through the front doors and introduce yourself to the planner as the owner." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the extravagant menu selections my mother had demanded. A dark, complicated realization washed over me. Canceling the event would just reinforce her twisted narrative that I was a bitter, vindictive failure trying to ruin her happiness. I didn't just want to ruin a single party. I wanted to entirely dismantle the toxic psychological hierarchy she had spent my entire life building. "No, Marcus," I finally said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "Do not cancel it. Approve every single ridiculous upgrade they asked for. Make sure the service is absolutely flawless." A few days later, a thick, gold-embossed invitation arrived in the mail at my old apartment address. My parents had invited me, not out of genuine love, but to serve as a stark, pathetic contrast to Julian's fabricated success. They needed the family failure present to make the golden child look even brighter. I decided to RSVP as a standard, unremarkable family guest, hiding my true identity for just a little while longer. Deep down, a very small, broken part of my inner child still hoped they might see my success and change. I wanted to see if they could finally look at me and just be proud. The night of the grand anniversary gala finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, suffocating wave of anxiety and anticipation. The glass house looked absolutely spectacular, bathed in the soft, warm glow of hundreds of floating candles reflecting off the towering indoor waterfalls. I arrived exactly 30 minutes after the doors officially opened, intentionally skipping the formal receiving line. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wearing cheap, thrifted clothes or smelling like commercial kitchen sanitizer. I wore a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that fit me perfectly, paired with subtle, incredibly expensive diamond earrings I had bought for myself after clearing my first million in revenue. When I walked through the grand entrance, taking in the sheer opulence of my own creation, I felt a massive surge of quiet, unbreakable power. I spotted my parents immediately. They were holding court near the magnificent ice sculpture, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy, influential investors and socialites. Eleanor looked radiant in her silk dress, soaking up the desperate attention like a sponge. I took a deep breath, plastered a polite smile on my face, and approached the group to offer my congratulations. Before I could even finish my sentence, Eleanor's eyes snapped toward me, immediately scanning my outfit with a deeply critical, suspicious glare. She didn't offer a hug or a warm greeting. Instead, she leaned in close so the surrounding guests couldn't hear, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Chloe, I'm genuinely shocked you actually showed up," she sneered, her eyes raking over my emerald dress. "Is that a cheap rental? And please tell me you didn't park your beat-up little sedan in the valet line. How did you even afford the Uber to get to a neighborhood like this?" The small, hopeful child inside my heart instantly died, replaced entirely by cold, calculated armor. I swallowed the familiar lump of rejection and prepared myself for an evening of warfare. The mingling hour was a masterclass in psychological exclusion. Eleanor and my father moved gracefully through the massive ballroom, dragging Julian along like a prize show pony. They introduced him to tech CEOs, prominent real estate developers, and local politicians, loudly bragging about his supposed revolutionary investments and his non-existent startup acquisitions. Meanwhile, they actively, physically blocked me from participating in any meaningful conversations. Every time I approached a group to speak, Eleanor would strategically step right in front of me, turning her back to physically cut me out of the circle. It was a deeply childish, painfully familiar tactic she had used since I was a teenager to ensure I remained entirely invisible. I stood near a massive floral arrangement I had personally designed, sipping sparkling water and observing the absolute absurdity of the situation. A wealthy woman dripping in pearls asked Eleanor what I was currently doing for a living, gesturing vaguely in my direction. I froze, listening intently. My mother offered a heavily dramatic, incredibly fake sigh of maternal burden. "Oh, poor Chloe is transitioning right now," Eleanor lied smoothly, her voice carrying easily over the soft music. "She's unfortunately between jobs at the moment. We've offered to pay for her to go back to school and learn a real trade, but you know how stubborn young people can be. We are just praying she finds some stable direction soon before she completely ruins her future." The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood boil rapidly. She was standing in the exact center of my multi-million-dollar empire, drinking my imported champagne, and portraying me as a lazy, ungrateful charity case to her wealthy friends to garner fake sympathy. Marcus caught my eye from across the room, raising a single, questioning eyebrow as if asking for permission to intervene. I shook my head slightly, silently telling him to hold his position and wait for the climax. It took everything in me not to tear down the beautiful illusion they were projecting. The suffocating tension continued to build as Julian finally noticed me standing alone near the elegant mahogany bar. He practically swaggered over, holding a glass of scotch he clearly couldn't handle, his face flushed with arrogance and cheap alcohol. "Chloe," he drawled, looking me up and down with a condescending smirk. "Cute dress. Did you put that on a credit card, or did Mom slip you some petty cash before the event?" I maintained my completely neutral expression, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he so desperately craved. "I paid for it myself, Julian. My business is actually doing exceptionally well," I replied calmly, keeping my voice steady and measured. Julian barked a loud, highly obnoxious laugh that drew the attention of several nearby guests. "Right, the little catering hustle. Look, I don't want to sound entirely insensitive, but you really need to face reality," he said, stepping uncomfortably close. "I just closed a massive Series B funding round for a new crypto platform. I'm playing in the big leagues now, creating actual generational wealth. You're still serving hors d'oeuvres to people who are infinitely better than you." He took a dramatic sip of his scotch, swirling the ice cubes around the glass. "In fact," he continued, reaching into his tailored suit jacket and pulling out a crisp $50 bill. He aggressively shoved the money directly toward my chest. "Do me a huge favor, little sister. The bartender here is moving far too slow for my taste. Take this, go back into the service kitchen, and fetch me a fresh glass of the Macallan 18. Keep the change as a tip. You probably need it for rent this month anyway." He winked at me, fully expecting me to burst into humiliated tears and run out of the building. Instead, I calmly took the $50 bill from his hand, folded it neatly, and slipped it directly into my designer clutch. I smiled at him, knowing his pathetic financial reality was about to be completely exposed. The chimes sounded, signaling the 200 guests to take their assigned seats for the lavish, 5-course dinner service. I was placed at a terrible table in the absolute back corner of the room, seated next to a highly intoxicated distant cousin and a completely silent business partner of my father's. The disrespect was incredibly loud and entirely intentional. Once the main course of perfectly seared filet mignon was cleared, Eleanor gracefully stood up at the head table. She elegantly tapped her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon, demanding absolute silence from the massive room. The string quartet stopped playing. Eleanor beamed, launching into a deeply narcissistic, 20-minute speech about her flawless marriage, her immense sacrifices, and her profound social legacy. Then, predictably, she pivoted her attention directly to Julian. "We are just so incredibly blessed," Eleanor announced, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally installed. "To have a son like Julian. A true visionary, a brilliant mind, and a man who understands the deep value of hard work and massive success." The crowd offered a polite, enthusiastic round of applause. Julian practically beamed, soaking up the unearned validation. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She looked out across the sea of faces, her eyes locking onto my table in the dark corner. "Of course, parenting is always a challenging balance," she sighed, her tone shifting into a weaponized, condescending pity. "We also have Chloe, who, despite her eccentric choices and her failed little catering hobby, still managed to show up tonight. We love you, Chloe, even if we constantly worry about how you will ever survive in the real corporate world." Soft, awkward chuckles rippled through the wealthy crowd. The sheer cruelty of the unprovoked attack hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating, dead silence as every single eye found me. I didn't shrink down in my chair. I didn't burst into tears or run toward the nearest exit like the frightened, easily manipulated teenager I used to be. Instead, I slowly and deliberately pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. I stood up tall, smoothing the front of my emerald gown, and projected my voice clearly across the dead silent room without a microphone. "Thank you for the profound concern, Mother," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, terrifying calm. "But you really don't need to worry about my survival anymore. My little catering hobby is actually doing quite well these days." Eleanor's fake, polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. How dare I interrupt her perfect moment in front of her high society audience? "Chloe, please," Eleanor hissed into the microphone, her tone dripping with embarrassed rage. "Do not do this right now. Sit down and stop making an absolute fool of yourself. Nobody here wants to hear your delusions of grandeur." I took a few slow steps forward, closing the distance toward the head table. The crowd watched me with breathless anticipation, sensing the explosive drama unfolding. "It isn't a delusion, Mother. I just think if you are going to publicly discuss my financial status, we should at least be completely accurate about the facts," I replied, my gaze locked dead onto hers. Eleanor completely lost her carefully maintained composure. The mask slipped entirely. She gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles turning stark white. "You are a jealous, pathological liar," she screamed, abandoning the microphone entirely. "You have always been so incredibly bitter about Julian's massive success. You are a fraud, Chloe. A complete and utter fraud trying to ruin my perfect anniversary night because you have absolutely nothing else in your pathetic life." I watched the absolute fury ignite in her eyes as she prepared to destroy me. The argument escalated into a terrifying, explosive spectacle. The wealthy guests were shifting uncomfortably in their expensive seats, murmurs of shock rippling through the massive ballroom. My father finally stood up, his face flushed deep red with intense embarrassment. "Chloe, that is entirely enough," he barked, trying to assert his fading authority. "Apologize to your mother immediately and leave this building before you cause any more permanent damage to this family." I didn't move a single inch. I just stared at them, absorbing the final, desperate flailing of their toxic control. Eleanor was hyperventilating now, pointing her empty crystal flute directly at my face like a weapon. "I want her out. Right now?" she shrieked hysterically, looking wildly around the room for assistance. Her eyes landed on Marcus, my general manager, who had been standing quietly near the main entrance, observing the entire confrontation with a perfectly neutral, unreadable expression. "You there?" "The manager," Eleanor commanded loudly, snapping her manicured fingers aggressively in his direction. "I paid $80,000 for this exclusive venue. I demand that you call your security team this exact second and have this delusional fraud physically thrown out into the street where she belongs. Marcus slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket and began walking deliberately across the vast expanse of the ballroom floor. The heavy silence in the room amplified the sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking against the polished marble. Eleanor looked incredibly smug, crossing her arms and waiting for my imminent, humiliating expulsion. She was absolutely certain that her immense wealth and social status had bought her the power to destroy me in front of everyone. I locked eyes with Marcus, giving him the subtle, unspoken signal we had practiced beforehand. Marcus glided smoothly up to the head table, stopping exactly halfway between my raging mother and where I was standing calmly in the center of the room. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop onto the marble. Eleanor looked at him expectantly, gesturing violently toward me. "Well, what are you waiting for? Grab her and drag her out," she demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. Marcus didn't even look at her. He didn't signal for the security guard stationed near the exits. Instead, he turned his body entirely toward me. He reached down to the heavy, silver master clipboard he was carrying, flipping it open with practiced elegance. He extended his arm, offering the clipboard directly to me. Then, he offered a deep, highly respectful bow of his head. "The final service invoices have been tallied and are ready for your signature, boss," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the stunned room. "Also, how would you like to handle this specific guest disturbance?" The entire ballroom collectively gasped. The color drained from Eleanor's face so violently and completely, I thought she might actually faint. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish, unable to process the words she had just heard. "Be boss," she stammered weakly, looking wildly between me and Marcus. My father dropped back into his chair as if his knees had suddenly given out. Julian, the golden child, looked physically ill, completely forgetting his arrogant swagger. I slowly took the clipboard from Marcus's hands, signing my name with a flourish on the top line. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, wildly confused eyes. "Thank you, Marcus. I think I'll handle this one personally," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. The absolute horror on my mother's face was a masterpiece I will cherish for decades. The complete, devastating collapse of their social facade was instantaneous. I calmly walked up to the podium, plucked the microphone from my mother's trembling, frozen hand, and turned to face the sea of shocked investors, socialites, and politicians. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight to celebrate with my parents," I announced, my voice crystal clear and heavily amplified. "I am Chloe Vance, the sole owner, founder, and CEO of the Glass House. I want to personally thank Eleanor and Richard for their incredibly generous $80,000 contribution to my company's quarterly revenue. It is truly inspiring to see a family fully support a local business." The crowd was entirely paralyzed, completely spellbound by the brutal, undeniable truth unfolding before them. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, entirely broken by the humiliation. But I wasn't quite finished. I turned my attention directly to my older brother, who was actively trying to shrink into the shadows of the table. "And Julian," I said, my tone shifting to ice, "before you go around handing out $50 bills to insult the staff, you might want to call your bank. Marcus informed me earlier that the backup credit card you aggressively tried to put on file for the open bar tab was completely declined for insufficient funds." Again, a collective, highly audible gasp ripped through the audience. Julian's fake billionaire persona was instantly shattered in front of the exact tech CEOs and investors he desperately needed to impress. He couldn't even formulate a denial. My brother stared down as the heavy weight of his own financial lies crushed him. The devastating fallout the next morning was swift, chaotic, and incredibly predictable. My phone was completely flooded with dozens of frantic text messages from Eleanor, violently swinging between demanding a massive family discount for the emotional distress I allegedly caused and desperately begging to meet for lunch so we could reconnect as a loving family. Julian's phone was apparently disconnected, his entire fraudulent financial house of cards collapsing after the public humiliation at the gala. I didn't reply to a single one of Eleanor's frantic, manipulative messages. Instead, I had Marcus formally draft the final, completely itemized invoice for the event, ensuring every single upcharge and premium service was billed at the absolute maximum corporate rate. I sent it directly to their accountant's email with a strict 30-day late fee warning attached. They paid the bill entirely in full within 2 hours. I haven't spoken a single word to any of them since that night, and honestly, the profound silence in my life is absolutely beautiful. Therapy has taught me that you cannot force toxic people to respect you. You can only remove their access to your energy. I used to spend so many agonizing nights wondering why I wasn't good enough to earn my parents' basic love and validation. I thought my grueling hard work would eventually buy their approval. But standing in the center of the massive, breathtaking empire I built with my own 2 hands, watching their shallow illusions completely shatter, I finally understood the truth. I was never the problem. I finally realized that true power is simply walking away and building your own table.